Good afternoon everybody, it's Brett here, Lionheart84. I thought I'd do a video about, just a general video about growing tropical fruit plants and some of the difficulties that you're likely to encounter here. Some of the barriers and things that will prove to make them very difficult to grow. Some of them are obviously fairly common sense and some you wouldn't always think of. And I would say that these are just my personal opinions and experiences from trying to keep the plants alive. It doesn't necessarily mean that that the facts are correct, and obviously in different areas and different circumstances you're going to encounter different issues to the ones I've had. But I think a lot of people don't always think about the likely difficulties that you might encounter trying to grow these plants here. If you run through the things in order, there's quite a number of factors that you need to take into account. Obviously, the most obvious one is climate. Most of the plants that I'm talking about now are true subtropicals, or really what I call tropicals. Not so much Mediterranean, not so much the Mediterranean plants, which would encompass citrus because they're a little bit easy to grow and you don't need such difficult conditions for them. But I'm more talking about the true tropicals, sort of mangoes, guavas, papaya, custard apples, ice cream beans, sapodillas, the ones that you would think as true tropicals, because it's quite possible to go out and perhaps buy fruit and grow some seeds for a bit of fun, like an avocado or a mango, and quite often you'll have a seedling come up and it might well grow. It might last for 6 months and it might last for 5 years. There's lots of possibilities, but one of the problems with them is their longevity and it's understanding what causes the problem. So if you run through things in order, as I said, the first thing I normally take is climate. So the first thing you need to look at is heat, or summer heat. We're here in the UK, and that means that if you're growing these plants, a combination of outside and indoors in winter, obviously we don't get tropical weather. Let's be honest, most of the summer, from sort of June through to the end of August, it's safe to say that our climate tends to hover around the sort of somewhere around the high teens and low 20s in centigrade, which is in the 70 75 degrees Fahrenheit bracket. We don't get consistently temperatures in the 80s and 90s, whereas in a lot of their natural habitat these trees would certainly experience temperatures in the 70s and 80s in Fahrenheit and higher all year round. So certainly into the high 20s and low 30s pretty much all year round, quite consistent heat in fact. Conversely, the opposite obviously of heat is the cold. Clearly these trees come from a climate where the temperatures tend to drop no lower than the mid-50s at their worst times in winter, and probably and invariably warmer than that. So I mean, mid-50s is going to be low teens in centigrade, and obviously our winters here are nothing like that. I mean, basically from November through to the end of April we're likely to have frosts at least once a week, and daytime temperatures tend to be somewhere between the high 30s and high 40s through the whole of winter. So there's zero chance of these tropical plants surviving outside. We also have excessive amounts of rain, especially in winter here, so they're going to suffer from, even if you could keep them alive and the temperatures outside, for sure the roots are going to rot away. And there are other things obviously which are aligned to climate, which include humidity and light. Now if I give you an example, I've got a humidity meter here. Now this is inside my house, and the humidity is currently 54% here, and it actually tends to stay in here in my kitchen between about 45 and 55% most of the time, because obviously the kitchen is one of the moister rooms in the house, and I have got the plants here growing on trays with gravel in, which I tend to keep moist, and I keep them slightly on the moist side inside, so the humidity is high. But if you compare this to outside, if I put this humidity meter outside at the moment, it would be giving a humidity reading of about 90%. So unless you're in a dry desert climate, the outside is invariably more humid than inside. And you can see the temperature here is 17 degrees centigrade at the moment, so that's I think it's about 63 degrees Fahrenheit, and it doesn't vary much in the house actually. The lowest it gets in here is normally about 15 centigrade, and the highest it gets in winter is probably about 22 centigrade when the heating's fully on. So that's fairly consistent all year round. Now the Victorians, when they started trying to grow tropical fruits such as pineapples, sort of really got this down pat, because when they were very successful Victorians, they were very good engineers, and they used to build what were called stove houses, which were like giant greenhouses attached to houses that were heated with heating pipes and kept very humid. Now that worked well. They were quite successful in growing things like pineapples, but I don't believe they had an awful lot of success in growing things like avocados and mangoes, because I think they basically thought if you had a hot, humid, a warm, humid atmosphere inside these stove houses, you'd automatically get tropical fruits growing. But of course, although they had what I call orangeries, which they developed for citrus fruits, they were very successful, but the stove houses actually didn't normally produce fruits, and there's a lot of other reasons for that I'm going to go into in a minute. One of the main things the Victorians probably missed out on, and which a lot of people don't think about, is light. The further north you go, or the further south you go, then obviously you get longer daylight periods in our summers, but conversely it means when you get to winter we get shorter and shorter daylight periods. So if I give you an example, at this time of the year now, coming into December, as we head towards our shortest day, the daylight, and it's not very good quality daylight because the sun's very low on the horizon, the daylight is probably down to about 8 at our shortest, down to about 8 hours daylight, which obviously means you're going to get sort of that's going to leave you with, let me see, 24, 15 or 16 hours darkness or twilight. Now a lot of these tropical plants grow between the Tropic of Cancer, which is roughly 23.5 degrees north, and the Tropic of Capricorn, which is roughly 23.5 degrees south. And that means they get very close in between the two tropics, and getting nearer to the equator. You get a very consistent sort of daylight period, which is pretty much close to 12 hours, nearly 12 hours daylight and 12 hours night all year round. So these tropical plants are used to having the equal daylight. So if you can imagine when they get into our darkened areas, and this was the problem in Victorian stove houses, although they had the temperatures cranked up nice and high and lots of humidity, they obviously didn't realise that the plants weren't getting enough light to continuously grow in the winter periods, and that affected drastically flower and fruit production. So, which we'll go into more in a minute. Now, one of the other issues obviously is space. Goes without saying. I mean, you can look behind me and see that I've probably got about 20 plus tropical fruit trees of various sorts. Now they're all quite small, some of them are up to 5 feet tall, but I will plan to keep them to about 6 feet tall by about 3 feet wide, because obviously unless you've got an unlimited large conservatory or greenhouse or a huge house, these plants have to come inside. Now if you're growing them outside, clearly you can you have as much garden space as you've got will allow you to plant what you want to plant. But even if you put these plants outside in summer, as I do, they still have to go somewhere in winter to keep them frost free and in reasonably dry conditions. So clearly space is a huge factor when you're trying to grow tropical fruits, as you're not going to get a mango on a 2 foot tall plant. Obviously in the wild, these things don't start fruiting until they're about 7 or 8 feet tall and probably about 6 or 7 years old. So if you're growing a 2-foot mango in a 12-inch pot, it's not likely to be able to produce flowers and fruit, and produce produce mature fruit. Next problem when you try to grow these plants: pollination. Now, if you're fortunate enough to be able to get one of your fruit trees to a flowering stage, and let's be honest, some of them are self-fertile, but some of the tropical fruits aren't even self-fertile. So if you haven't got a male and female flower or male and female plant, you're not likely to get pollination. But if you can imagine, when you take these trees out of the tropics, then clearly you're taking them away from their natural pollinators. Now, it might be beetles, special beetles, flies, special types of butterfly, hummingbirds, but there are all sorts of natural pollinators that they would have in their own region where they grow that you're very unlikely to get here. I mean, there are quite a few tropical fruits that are pollinated by hummingbirds. Well, we don't have hummingbirds in the UK, and probably not in the rest of Europe, but there are certainly quite a number of fruit trees that are pollinated by specific beetles and flies, and obviously they are not here existing in our houses or indeed in our gardens. So you have to think carefully about whether or not the trees can even be hand pollinated, because in the case of ones which have to be pollinated, obviously you have to know all about the pollination and how to carry it out. And again, that's why the Victorians didn't have much success in growing certain tropical fruits, because they didn't realise that they would need to be pollinated, and in some cases obviously didn't have self-fertile flowers anyway. Atmospheric quality. Obviously we are trying to clean up our air here in the UK, but certainly there is more pollution in the air here than you would get in some of the wilder parts of the tropics where these plants grow. I mean, obviously there are some countries now which are producing huge amounts of pollution, which is bad for the plants, but a lot of these plants aren't used to our sort of polluted natural air, so that probably has an effect on them as well, although they seem to be growing mostly okay on the whole. Soil types. It sounds like common sense, but these trees some of them come from areas where they have very dense, heavy, damp soil, almost swamp-like conditions, and others will come from very light, well-drained, sandy, high organic fibre soils. So they're used to having good draining soils that give them a lot of air around the roots, and even the things you don't think of, like their natural mycorrhiza, which they have in their own climates, and natural insects which are living in the soil, can have effect on the plants and how their roots grow, because some of these tropical fruits grow quite symbiotically with various types of root fungi, and of course they're not going to have those here, because we're just going down and buying a bag of potting compost from the local nursery, and probably blending in some organic material and grit and sand for improved drainage and possibly cocoa fibre. But you're not going to give these plants the natural mycorrhiza that they will be growing with, so that's going to make a difference to them. So you have to think carefully about what soil type you try to pot these plants in, and do your research, because some of them need quite acidic soils, some are fairly easygoing, and some of them need slightly more alkaline soils. Some of the plants can't tolerate salts and high mineral contents in the soil. So again, you really need to try and do your research if you can, if you want to try and grow any of these plants. Pests and diseases. Naturally, in their own habitats, they do suffer pests and diseases, and they may well be different pests and diseases to what they experience here in the UK. I think most countries will have scale insects and mealybugs and red spider mites, but obviously the different atmospheric conditions and different soil conditions and different temperatures in their own climates are likely to have quite a big effect on the type of pests that can affect the plants here. I tend to find here that the guava last year got thrips on it. the passion fruits and the citrus, and some of the others were custard apples were affected by mealy bugs. Obviously, we get a lot of scale insects on the citrus fruits in particular, and some of the fruits I'm growing here didn't seem to get any insects on them at all. Certainly the red spider mites attacked the, trying to think what they caused the problem on now. I know the babaco or mountain papaya got some red spider mites on it, but there were a couple of, oh yes, I got a lot of red spider mites on the star fruit. Well, that might not be a problem where they come from originally, when, I don't really know because I'm not experienced at growing them abroad. So pests and disease is an issue, and they may well suffer from diseases and viruses here that they've never experienced in their own climate because they haven't got an immunity to them. Accidental and natural damage. These plants, obviously, some of them might be growing in an area where you get hurricanes, but a lot of them grow in areas where the weather's quite consistently sort of not stormy. They might get heavy rain, but they're not likely to get heavy winds, for example. And when you're growing these plants in pots, they're far more prone to unexpected damage. I mean, my son had a party. We had a few parties in summer actually, and one day I came into the kitchen and some of his friends had probably had a bit too much to drink, and one of them gave another one a shove and they fell on top of one of my custard apples and snapped several stems off. So I wasn't best pleased, but it's only an accident at the end of the day, so I wasn't going to get angry over it. But that was physical damage that I wasn't expecting the plant to get, on top of all the other challenges I have. And outside, obviously, if they're growing in containers outside, which I try to do from the beginning of May through to the end of October, which I did successfully do this year, several times after we'd had high winds, I came home and found plants lying on the floor. I mean, I think the grapefruit tree must have been blown over about 6 times, and in the end I had to put a concrete slab on top of the pot to try and stop it getting blown over. And the ones that are more prone to blowing over, I try to I've got like a railing that goes around the deck, and what I try to do is lean them against the railing so they can't blow over easily, or even tie them in place. But some of them, like star fruits and tamarillos, are extremely prone to wind damage. They're very sensitive to wind, especially cold winds, and the cold winds will obviously cause a lot of the young growth to be burnt and die off, and the leaves fall off. So that's just a few of the problems to think about. Now, you can quite easily grow a lot of these tropical fruit plants as ornamentals, although I would say that a lot of them are no more than green foliage plants. They're not the most exciting things you'd want to grow in your house, because they don't really sort of, when you're looking at them here, you don't look and go, wow, what a fabulous looking plant. Some of them have lovely growth when it comes out. The new growth might come out and be a nice sort of a pink or red or yellow colour, and some of them do get some leaf coloration changes. But as I said, one of the hardest things is, after you've kept them alive, is trying to get them to flower. If you look at the different climatic conditions, if you think most of these plants, as I said, grow between the area that covers the Tropic of Cancer to the Tropic of Capricorn, it means they consistently get quite warm temperatures all year round, which means they can theoretically grow all year round. Now, the thing to think about is, sometimes even within those tropics, some of the fruit trees are exposed to what would be considered to be dry seasons, where they may get very little rain for several months of the year, and this can be one of the things that can trigger them to produce flowers or new growth, which is something we're not necessarily going to be able to copy here, because even if we withhold water, the daylight conditions are going to be different and the humidity is going to be different, so it doesn't necessarily mean the plant's going to be triggered into growing. Now, the other thing to think about with the fact that they come from a climate where they can grow all year round, so they don't really have a dormant period, is if you compare that to our proper deciduous cold climate trees like apples, cherries, pears, plums, nectarines, anything like that. Those plants that we grow here are conditioned to our climate. So obviously they're dormant in the winter months. They come into growth in the spring and sort of February, March, April time, and they produce their flowers, and then they then produce their fruit. Well, if you get things like plums, apricots, nectarines, they will tend to flower in February, and by about July or August the fruit are ready. The apples tend to flower in March and April, and it only takes them about 4 to 5 months to fully develop and ripen their fruit. So you will get your apples from probably September through to October, and some varieties further. These tropical fruits haven't been conditioned to produce fruit in 4 or 5 months because they're used to a stable climate all year round. And of course, the closer you get to the equator, then the more stable the temperature will be all year round and the more tropical the fruit gets. So frankly, there's really no point trying to try growing a durian or a mangosteen here in the UK, because they tend to come from very consistently warm tropical areas and they're much closer to the equator. So if you can't keep your temperatures really above 55, 60 Fahrenheit all winter and humid, you've got very little chance of even keeping a mangosteen and durian alive. You've got far more chance with an avocado, mango, papaya, as long as you can keep your temperatures above 45, 50, because they are a little bit more cold tolerant. But one of the issues you've got to consider is the time these tropical fruits take to develop their fruits. Now, to give an example, I've got, and that's in our climate, if I turn this sideways slightly, you can see down in the corner there my mountain papaya or babaco. Now, in their natural climate where they grow, those fruits take about 6 to 7 months from flower to grow to full size and ripen to maturity. Well, my babacos now, if I remember rightly, I believe the flowers set in about May, so we're now November, 6 or 7 months later, and they are probably only half grown towards maturity. So it's a challenge to keep them on the plant, but I would say at the rate they're growing, and because of the lack of light now and the lack of warmth this time of year, they're probably, if they stay on the plant, they're going to take the best part of between 10 and 12 months to get to an edible size. And you've got the same problems with a lot of other fruits. Avocados, for example, will take 12 months to get to maturity on a tree, and that's probably going to be extended even longer here in our climate if you can keep them on the tree for 12 months, given the fact how cold and wet we're likely to be in our winters. My grapefruit tree there, which is getting new flower buds on it, it's about 5 to 6 feet tall now. It's got grapefruits on which I suppose are less than an inch in diameter. Now that flowered, I think that flowered back in August, so we're now August, September, October, November. We're now 4 months later and the fruits haven't even got to the size of a small cherry basically. Well, I believe grapefruits take 12 months to develop to a fruit to an edible size. So you've got to think about these fruits have to be pampered and looked after for 9, 10, 11, 12 months or more to even get something edible. Now, there are some tropicals that are a lot quicker. I think there's one called the Barbados cherry. I think that's might be a Muntingia, not too sure. Now I've heard, and I haven't got one because I haven't been able to buy one, I've heard that their fruits go from flower to fruit in about a month. So something like five weeks. Well, probably slightly longer here, but I think there's a fair bet that if you could grow them here, you'd be able to get fruit within about 6 or 7 weeks, which make them very, very feasible to grow them here. And I've watched some people, there are some fruits that obviously do fruit a lot quicker. They fruit as smaller plants and they develop their fruit quicker. One that comes to mind is the strawberry cherry guava and the lemon cherry guavas. Now these produce fruits that are only about an inch and a half across, and they're one of the few that you might be able to successfully fruit in this country. I think they take, I've seen people growing them on YouTube here in the UK and on my Facebook, and they have actually got ripe fruits on their plants. Now they're tough, they will get down to near to freezing, but you need to keep them inside. They're fairly compact, you can keep them to about 4 feet tall and about 3 feet wide, and you've got a good chance of them flowering here in June or July and having ripe fruit by about November. And it's not too challenging to keep the fruit on them because I've seen them with ripe fruit. But even the more regular tropical guava will probably take 8 to 9 months to produce fruit. Bananas, if you could grow one, going to take 9 months from flower to fruit ripeness. I suspect the star fruit here will take about 5 or 6 months to ripeness. So not only have you got the challenge of getting them to flower and then trying to pollinate them in some way, you've then got the challenge of keeping the trees in the right growing conditions for the fruit to stay on the tree. So that really is quite a challenge, because we're so far outside the tropics. Everything we have here, atmosphere, light, heat, cold, humidity, everything is wrong for these plants. So just, you need to think very carefully. If you're going to have the fun of germinating a seed, you're not necessarily going to get fruit, because even if you get flowers, it's not necessarily going to set fruit and keep them. I quite often get flowers appear on, I showed the other day, I've got some flowers on a mango, and I've got some embryo flower buds on one of my cherimoyas. But one of the problems I've found when I move them inside is the dry atmosphere and the cooler temperatures tend to cause the flower buds to dry up and fall off before they actually open. And I've got the same problem with a lot of the young growth here. Although it's 50% humidity in here approximately, and I do try to spray the plants, they really would prefer to have something like 70 or 80% humidity. So what I tend to find in winter is when they try to grow, and quite a few of my plants behind me have got young shoots on them at the moment, I think a combination of the dry atmosphere and the lack of light causes the young shoots to dry up and fall off. It doesn't really affect the plant badly, because what tends to happen is when it gets warmer in the spring and the daylight hours get longer, they produce more buds and new shoots, and they get going again. But I do lose quite a few leaves to drying up and falling off in the winter. Some of the plants seem to adapt better than others. I've noticed that the custard apple family, the cherimoyas, and I've got some custard apples and sugar apple plants, they seem to adapt very well to the drier atmosphere in the house. They don't seem to suffer as much as, say, the mangoes and the star fruit. And also, naturally, the custard apple family tend to have a rest period in the spring of a couple of months where they quite often lose most of or all of their leaves. I think it's because they come from slightly higher altitudes, and also areas where they have a little bit of a dry season, which triggers a new growth and the new flowers in the spring. But again, the problem is, if I ever manage to successfully pollinate any of my cherimoyas, I've no idea if I'm going to be able to keep fruits on. And so I'm quite pleased with how the babaco's done, to be honest, and the fact that the grapefruit set fruit, and I've got limes with fruits on. Some plants have definitely got a good chance here, but I don't think it's likely that I'll ever might be able to get papayas if I can keep them alive in winter. I might get papaya fruits possibly to a small ripe stage, because they they'll grow as long as you keep the temperatures up. They're very quick growing, but I think it's highly unlikely that I'll ever get anything on my mangoes. Again, probably not likely on the custard apples or cherimoyas. Certainly the larger fruity ones. Some I just like growing for the challenge of growing the plant, seeing if I can keep it alive. You can't presume that they're ever going to flower or fruit here, but half the fun sometimes is just to see if you can do the impossible. I've got a rose apple plant that I believe is likely to flower at a smaller size, and of course the smaller the fruits that particular plant produces, such as a rose apple, they're only about an inch 1.5 across, and I've got some sapodilla plants, and obviously those fruits are only about the size of an egg, I suppose, or so maybe 2 inches long. And ice cream bean, I don't know. It produces big pods, but it may well fruit or flower at a small size. But you know, you have to think about a lot of these plants don't start fruiting until they're 8 or 10 feet tall and about 8 or 10 years old. So it's going to be very, very hard to keep them alive and that long here. The other thing to think about is if you grow them from seed, a large number, you're okay with things like papayas, but a large number of tropical fruits don't come true from seed. They naturally vary. So, you know, if you think you could spend 6 or 7 years growing a seedling to a fruiting size, and then if it gets a fruit on it, it tastes absolutely revolting, it's a bit of a disappointment. So I do tend to try and buy small plants of named varieties that are either grafted or grown from cuttings, because I can't, firstly it saves about 3 or 4 years, and the challenge of germinating the seeds on some of them is quite tricky, but the whole idea is if I'm going to get any fruits ever, it would be nice to have fruits that at least might possibly be edible, just for the satisfaction of taking a picture and posting it on Facebook and saying, look, here's a star fruit or a lychee or something that I've grown myself in the UK, which is considered to be impossible. Now, unfortunately, I haven't got a greenhouse or conservatory. Obviously, as you can see, my kitchen is full of plants, but I'm fortunate enough to have big glass sliding doors, so at least they get as much light as it's possible to get, but it's nowhere near the lights they would get in their own natural habitat in their own climate. So, you know, basically at the end of the day, anything I get, keeping them alive, any flowers, any embryo fruits, I will consider a fantastic bonus and a great reward for trying to do the impossible. Everybody always says I'm mad, but you know, it's fun. I mean, I've got subtropical and exotic fruits outside. I've got persimmon plants, I've got figs, I've got pineapple, guavas. I mean, I'm trying some American pawpaws. It makes a lot more sense to try and grow things that you can actually grow outside in our climate, and there's plenty of unusual stuff if you want to sort of get away from growing apples and pears, which, let's be honest, you can buy in any supermarket or shop so cheaply you don't have to worry about it. But I've always thought it's a bit of fun just to try and grow things that not many people are growing. And I have seen recently a video over here of someone who had a very small mango they successfully managed to produce on a mango plant in this country, I presume growing in a greenhouse or conservatory. So it's not impossible, but even when you go to Kew, even at Kew Gardens, where they have huge greenhouses and what you would think would be perfect conditions, it's almost unheard of for them to get things like mangoes and durians and breadfruit and stuff like that there, because it's just very hard in our daylight and atmospheric conditions to give these plants what they need all year round to get them to produce fruit. And even more so when you're only growing them in a container, you're not even growing them in the soil, so they have very restricted root growth, which restricts the size of the plant and obviously restricts the likelihood of them putting much energy into fruit. The only one advantage you've got is if you keep them in small pots, it does tend to force the plant to try and produce flowers and fruits, but don't expect to get 200 star fruits on your star fruit plant that's only 5 feet tall and 2 feet wide. If I get any star fruits at all, I'm only expecting to see 3 or 4 on it, but if I could get them to maturity, I'd be very, very happy. Anyway, I just thought I'd do a talk. Hopefully I'm not going to have to edit this too much because I haven't made too many mistakes when I'm talking, but I just thought that if you've got an interest in trying to germinate and grow unusual fruit, you have got a lot to think about 12 months of the year. You've got to have space, heat, not too much cold, humidity, keep a close check on pests, careful not to get accidental damage. If you do get flowers, are you going to be able to pollinate them and get them fertilised so you get any fruits? And if you do get any fruits on the plants, you're going to be looking after them for possibly 9 or 12 months, keep them on the tree until they get to until they get to the size where they're edible and will ripen. As I said, the babicos, I'll show you again, the babicos I've got here, which I think you can see. The largest one there is probably about 6 or 7 inches long, and normally they'd probably be 12 inches long fully grown. Now, as we're only in the 1st of December at the moment, I have absolutely no idea if those fruits are going to hang on the tree for another 4 or 5 months. I don't know if they're going to fall off green. I don't know if they're going to stay on the tree and start growing again in the spring and then eventually turn orange. I could easily see that they wouldn't be ripe until they've been on the plant at least a year, as opposed to their natural growing conditions. But I said I'm quite pleased with how everything's looking. I have lost some leaves on things like the star fruit, which is this one just behind me. Has a tendency to turn a lot of the leaves yellow, but again it's mostly due to the different climate conditions here, and I think particularly one of the problems is just the lack of light compared to what they're used to in their own country. The light intensity is certainly no good here in winter, but anyway, I thought I'd do a longish video talking about some of the challenges and the fun I've got trying to grow tropical plants here in the UK. I've certainly come across plenty of other people who've got tropicals growing, although I think I've got one of the wider ranges from what I've seen. Try and stick initially, I would, if I were you, could certainly stick initially to things like guavas, because they're quite tough plants, will take quite cold temperatures. They're happy to grow in smallish containers. Obviously I have got various papayas, mountain papayas, passion fruits, and various other, some very unusual plants. I have no idea how they're going to get on, but I'll try and keep them all alive, and I'll try and post videos every so often the next year or two to see what happens. And obviously if any do develop any flowers, I'll certainly feature those in videos and updates, and if any of them get any embryo fruit which stay on the plant, I'll most definitely be featuring those. And if there's anything that you want to ask, I can't promise that I'll know the answers, and the answers I give might be totally wrong because they're only my own opinions. But if there's anything you want to know, by all means post the questions or make a comment, and I'll try and answer them for you. I'm sure there's a few things I've forgotten to mention today that was on my mind to do, but here we are trying to grow tropical fruit plants, or at least keep them alive in a cool, temperate, oceanic climate. Can't be left outside in winter. There's simply no chance of them surviving. But if you haven't got room to have them indoors, then I suggest sticking to slightly more unusual fruits you can grow outside, like the pineapple guavas and loquats, which are perfectly hardy, persimmons, American pawpaw, figs, mulberries. There's plenty of things you can grow if you want to go a bit off the beaten track and try unusual stuff. You haven't got to restrict yourself to cherries and plums and apricots and apples and pears. As nice as they are, some people just like me, just like to be different and grow things differently. But anyway, I think I've waffled on for long enough now. I've said that hopefully I haven't made too many mistakes I'm going to have to edit out. It's nearly 40 minutes, which is certainly the longest video I've made by a long stretch, and I know most people only like to watch short videos, so they're probably not going to watch all the way through this anyway, but hopefully I've pointed out a couple of things that might prove useful to some people. If you've got a lovely big heated greenhouse or conservatory, then you've probably got a lot more chance than me of getting these plants to a decent size and getting some flowers and fruits on them, but I shall carry on persevering. But thanks anybody who's taken the trouble to watch. Appreciate you looking. Obviously you're welcome to give this video a thumbs up or a thumbs down. I won't be offended if you didn't like what you heard or disagree with everything I've said. And obviously you're welcome to share the link or video with anyone else who you think might have an interest in anything I've had to say. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so and you'd like to see more of this kind of content. And obviously if you hit the bell, you'll know when I post future videos. You can have a look at them and see if they're of any interest to you. Thanks for watching anyway. It's a lovely Sunday. I'm going to put some Christmas decorations up now, I hope. Hasn't been too cold today, and I managed to get some videos done outside as well, but I'll catch up in the next video, and this is Brett out for now. Thanks for watching, everybody.